She didn't warn me with words. She warned me with a smile. The kind that made every instinct say run, even as every heartbeat whispered stay. When she leaned in and whispered, "You don't even know what trouble looks like yet," I realized she was right. The first time I saw her, I didn't know I should be careful. I had come over to my friend's house, expecting a quiet evening filled with familiar jokes, half-finished snacks, and the comfort of easy conversation. The golden light spilling through the living room windows made everything feel warm and ordinary, the faint scent of dinner still lingering in the air. I had no reason to anticipate that the night would unravel the way it did. And then she appeared. It wasn't dramatic, no cinematic entrance or loud declaration. She moved through the room as if she owned nothing, and yet somehow commanded everything. The way she walked, effortless, poised, deliberate, drew attention without asking for it. A simple tilt of her head, a quiet laugh, a soft glance in my direction, and suddenly the room felt smaller, charged with something I couldn't quite name. Her presence was subtle, magnetic, almost dangerous in its casual perfection. I caught the first flicker of it when our eyes met. She smiled. Not at me, exactly, but in a way that made me feel as if the world had narrowed to just that single moment. My chest tightened without warning, my thoughts scattering as if they had been caught in an unexpected storm. It wasn't lust exactly. It was awareness, recognition, the sense that something unseen had shifted, and I was caught in its pull. I reminded myself who she was, my friend's mom, that was supposed to settle everything, to keep my mind grounded and my behavior appropriate. But something about the confidence in her eyes, the ease in her gestures, and the warmth of her laugh made my usual boundaries feel fragile, like they might crumble if I wasn't careful. Every small movement she made, the soft brush of her fingers as she reached for a plate, the way she leaned in slightly when talking to someone, left an imprint I couldn't ignore. By the time I realized I was following her subconsciously across the room, pretending to help carry a tray or offer a hand, the tension had settled around us like a quiet fog. She spoke to me casually, teasing even, but there was an edge to her voice, a subtle challenge hidden beneath the softness. "Careful," she said once, her tone light but measured. "You might not know what you're getting yourself into." I laughed, nervously, unsure if I should. The laugh came out too loud, too eager, but it didn't seem to matter. She didn't correct me. She let the moment linger, letting her eyes hold mine just long enough for the unspoken understanding to pass between us. That's when I felt it fully, the thrill, the danger, the undeniable spark that whispered there was more to her than the polite, contained persona she presented to the rest of the world. By the end of the evening, the small interactions, the accidental touches, the subtle glances, the quiet smiles, had built a tension I couldn't ignore. And then, just before I left, leaning casually against the kitchen counter as if the world existed only in that room, she whispered the words that would echo in my mind long after. "You don't even know what trouble looks like yet." It wasn't a warning. Not entirely. It was a promise, a spark, a challenge. And I realized, with a mix of fear and exhilaration, that I didn't want to run. I wanted to see exactly what kind of trouble she could be. The next evening, I couldn't stop replaying her words in my head. "You don't even know what trouble looks like yet." The memory of her voice, soft and teasing but layered with certainty, had etched itself into me. Every ordinary sound in my apartment, the hum of the fridge, the rustle of leaves outside, somehow reminded me of the subtle gravity of her presence. I knew I shouldn't think about her this way, yet the thought alone made my pulse quicken. When I arrived at my friend's house, I felt an odd mix of anticipation and anxiety. I came to hang out, as always, but part of me was acutely aware that nothing about the evening would be ordinary this time. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and vanilla, the low murmur of the TV filling the background, but all I could focus on was the idea of seeing her again. And then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, she appeared. She moved through the room with that same effortless grace, hair loosely pinned back, the soft glow of the lamp catching strands that framed her face perfectly. She didn't rush, didn't demand attention, yet the entire space seemed to bend subtly around her. Even from across the room, I felt the pull, the gravitational tug of someone completely aware of herself and of how she affected others. Our first interaction that night was accidental, or at least I told myself it was. She was reaching for a bowl at the same time I was, and our fingers brushed lightly. The contact was brief, almost negligible, but it sent a jolt through me that made my stomach twist. She didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. There was a quiet confidence in her demeanor, a subtle acknowledgement that this spark between us existed and was noticed. She laughed softly at something my friend said, but the sound resonated differently for me. I noticed the tiny details, the crinkle of her eyes, the smooth curve of her fingers, the way her shoulders relaxed when she was comfortable. Everything about her presence felt deliberate, yet natural, as if she existed perfectly balanced between control and ease. Throughout the evening, these small moments continued to accumulate, almost imperceptibly at first. A touch on the arm while passing a plate, a glance that lingered a heartbeat too long, the faint warmth of her hand brushing mine during some trivial task in the kitchen. All of it built a tension I couldn't escape. I felt simultaneously guilty and thrilled, aware of the boundaries I was crossing in thought alone. Yet her presence was intoxicating, pulling me closer even when I tried to resist. At one point, she caught me staring, not in accusation, but in amusement. She leaned slightly closer, tilting her head, letting her eyes lock with mine just a moment longer than necessary. Her gaze was challenging and playful, yet grounded, as if testing me, seeing whether I could meet her unspoken dare. My pulse surged, words faltering on the tip of my tongue, and I realized that she already knew exactly what effect she had on me, and that she was enjoying it. By the time I left that night, my thoughts were tangled. Every glance, every brush of hands, every subtle laugh felt like a deliberate spark. I had come for my friend, as always, but I left knowing that the real attraction, the dangerous, exhilarating pull, was entirely elsewhere. She had set the stage. She had whispered the rules, and I was already hooked. The days that followed were strange in their quiet intensity. Every visit to my friend's house felt like stepping into a space charged with invisible electricity. I came expecting casual conversation, maybe a shared joke or two, but instead found myself hyper-aware of her presence in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the way she moved or spoke. It was the subtle gravitational pull she seemed to exert, drawing my attention without effort, weaving tension into every small interaction. That evening began like any other. I was helping my friend with something trivial, fumbling with a pile of books on the living room floor when she appeared. She didn't announce herself, didn't seek my notice, yet the air seemed to shift when she entered. Barefoot on the carpet, hair falling loosely around her shoulders, she moved with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly the effect she had. My pulse quickened before I even realized I had noticed it. Our first interaction was subtle, almost mundane. She handed me a mug of tea, but even this was layered with unspoken meaning. Our fingers brushed, briefly, a fleeting contact that lingered far longer in my awareness than it should have. She didn't pull away. She let the moment exist, letting me feel the weight of the unspoken connection building between us. I realized that this was her language. Small gestures, brief glances, tiny touches that carried more weight than words could ever convey. We settled into the couch across from each other, and the conversation began casually, about the day, trivial household stories, small observations. But beneath the surface, there was a quiet rhythm forming. Our knees brushed gently beneath the cushions. Every accidental touch, every subtle shift of posture, sent a thrill through me I couldn't contain. It wasn't just attraction. It was a growing awareness, a tension that demanded recognition, a magnetic pull neither of us could, or would, resist. At one point, she leaned slightly forward, adjusting something in her lap, and our hands touched again. The warmth, the softness, the subtle intimacy of that contact made my chest tighten. I could feel the electricity sparking between us, a slow burn that was no longer subtle. Yet she didn't speak of it. She didn't need to. Her eyes, her movements, the smallest changes in expression were enough to communicate everything: challenge, curiosity, awareness, and an invitation to step closer, if I dared. I caught myself watching her, noticing details I had never truly seen before. The curve of her smile, the delicate tilt of her head, the softness in her voice where she laughed quietly at something I said. She seemed aware, always just one step ahead, gauging my reactions, letting me feel the tension without forcing it into words. It was intoxicating, thrilling, and entirely disarming. By the time I left that night, the slow burn had intensified. Each accidental brush of hands, every fleeting glance, every subtle smile had layered tension over tension, building a quiet, irresistible attraction that neither of us had spoken aloud. I realized then that the evening had changed something fundamental. I was no longer just a guest in the house. I was a participant in a delicate, charged game, one she seemed to have designed, and I was eager, perhaps foolishly, to play. And I knew, with a mix of fear and exhilaration, that I wanted to see exactly how far this slow burn could take us. The next evening, the tension felt different, heavier, more deliberate, impossible to ignore. I had arrived expecting casual conversation with my friend, but as soon as she appeared in the living room, carrying a tray of drinks with that effortless grace, my pulse betrayed me. Every movement she made, every subtle tilt of her head, every quiet laugh, the sway of her hair as it caught the lamplight, felt charged with meaning. I wasn't just noticing her anymore. I was aware of every detail, every gesture, and it made the air between us thick with unspoken electricity. She set the tray down, and our hands brushed again. This time, the contact lasted slightly longer, just enough for warmth to spread from her fingers to mine. I caught myself holding the moment, reluctant to pull away, reluctant to break the spell. She didn't withdraw. Instead, she tilted her head, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. Her eyes held a playful confidence, a quiet challenge. See how far you can follow me without getting burned. We sank onto the couch across from each other, and the world outside seemed to vanish. The room shrank, leaving only the space we occupied. Conversation began lightly, about nothing significant, but quickly shifted. Her questions were simple, almost casual, yet each carried a weight. She leaned slightly closer when she spoke, eyes fixed on mine with an intensity one couldn't ignore. There was an unmistakable pull in her voice, a teasing edge beneath the warmth, and I realized I was entirely captivated, not by her words, but by the rhythm of her presence. I noticed the small things, the way her hand rested near mine on the arm of the couch, the subtle brush of her hair as she tucked it behind her ear, the faint exhale that betrayed a moment of vulnerability. Each gesture was deliberate yet effortless, weaving a web of tension that was thrilling and dangerous. I wanted to reach out, to close the gap, but something in the way she held herself demanded patience, a respect for boundaries that existed only in the unspoken. "You think you can handle this?" she asked softly, her tone teasing, but there was an undercurrent of challenge in her voice. The question wasn't about words. It was about awareness, about testing the edges of the pull between us. I swallowed, trying to respond with confidence, but the words faltered. My heart raced, not from fear, but from the exhilarating danger of being entirely seen and entirely understood. We laughed quietly, the sound mingling with the soft hum of the house settling around us. Every accidental touch, our fingers brushing over a cup, the faint pressure a knee against mine, felt deliberate. Every glance she offered, every subtle shift in posture, made me acutely aware of how thin the line had become between restraint and surrender. I realized then that this slow burn wasn't just attraction. It was a quiet, intense challenge, a dance of awareness, teasing, and restraint that neither of us could, or wanted to, ignore. By the time I left, my thoughts were scattered, my pulse still racing. Each detail of that evening replayed endlessly in my mind. The warmth of her hand, the intensity of her gaze, the teasing undercurrent in her words. She had set the rules, and I had already broken them. Not overtly, but in every thought, every lingering glance, every moment of silent fascination. And I knew with clarity that this wasn't just the next step of attraction. This was something far more consuming, a slow burn that promised danger, excitement, and a connection I wasn't prepared to resist. By the fifth evening, the atmosphere in my friend's house had changed completely. What had once been casual visits were now charged with a quiet tension that hung between us like an invisible thread, pulling me toward her in ways I could neither anticipate nor resist. Each encounter had been a careful dance of glances, subtle touches, and unspoken challenges, and now the slow burn had deepened into something undeniably magnetic. I arrived, expecting the usual laughter and trivial conversations, but the moment she entered the room, I felt the familiar pull of her presence. She moved with that effortless grace, yet there was a deliberate awareness in the way she positioned herself near me. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, catching the lamplight in streaks of gold, and her eyes immediately found mine. A flicker of recognition, teasing yet deliberate, crossed her face, and it was enough to make my chest tighten. We ended up in the kitchen, alone for a fleeting moment. She leaned casually against the counter, posture relaxed, yet the subtle intensity in her gaze made the space between us feel electric. I reached instinctively to help her with something, a bowl, a plate, and our fingers brushed again. The contact lingered just slightly, but it was enough to send a shiver through me. She noticed, of course. Her eyes softened just enough to make me aware that she felt it too, without needing to say a word. "You think you're ready for this?" she asked, voice low, teasing, yet layered with intent. It wasn't a question about the mundane task at hand. It was about us, the tension that had been building for weeks, and the unspoken understanding that we were both aware of it. I hesitated, caught between desire and restraint, excitement and guilt, realizing that the pull between us had grown into something far more complex than either of us could admit outright. As the conversation drifted to lighter topics, we found ourselves sitting across from each other, knees brushing lightly under the table. Every accidental touch sent sparks through me, a reminder that even mundane gestures had taken on new weight. The faint warmth of her hand, the subtle tilt of her head, the softness of her laughter, all of it carried an intimacy that was impossible to ignore. I was acutely aware of her in a way that went beyond attraction. It was fascination, admiration, and desire wrapped into one intricate, unspoken bond. She leaned slightly closer, just enough for our shoulders to brush, and I realized that the slow burn had become undeniable. Our glances lingered, teasing and exploratory, and her playful challenge was clear. She was inviting me to acknowledge what had been building between us, to step closer if I dared. Yet there was a restraint in her movements, a quiet tension that demanded attention, patience, and awareness. By the time I left that night, my mind was a storm of thoughts and emotions. The teasing smiles, the subtle touches, the charged glances, they all replayed endlessly, leaving me both exhilarated and terrified. I understood that this slow burn had become a force neither of us could control, a delicate game of attraction and awareness that promised danger, excitement, and an undeniable pull towards something neither of us could yet define. And for the first time, I realized I didn't want to resist. By the sixth evening, the subtle tension between us had transformed into something far more tangible. I could no longer dismiss the way my chest tightened whenever she entered the room, or the way my mind traced every movement she made as if memorizing a rhythm I wasn't allowed to forget. The slow burn had become a steady, undeniable presence, hovering between us, daring us to acknowledge it without a single word spoken aloud. I arrived that night with my usual pretense of casual intent, helping my friend with a small task, but my awareness was entirely elsewhere. She appeared quietly, carrying a stack of magazines, her movements effortless yet deliberate. She didn't glance at anyone else in the room first. Her eyes sought mine almost immediately. That tiny spark of recognition passed between us, soft but potent, and I felt the familiar jolt of anticipation ripple through me. We gravitated toward the couch, ostensibly to sort through the magazines, but the pretense was thin. Every subtle movement was loaded with unspoken meaning. Our knees brushed under the cushions, our hands occasionally meeting as we reached for the same magazine, each contact lingering just long enough to remind me of the magnetic pull between us. She noticed, of course. The faint, almost imperceptible smile she offered acknowledged the tension without shattering it, inviting me into a delicate game I was only too willing to play. "You've been thinking about it, haven't you?" she asked softly, voice low, teasing, yet filled with certainty. Her eyes held mine, searching, daring, playful. I hesitated, caught off guard by the precision of her observation. It wasn't a challenge in words, but in presence. She had already read me completely. The flicker of hesitation in my glance, the way my fingers lingered near hers, the subtle tightening of my chest. And she had chosen to point it out. As we settled into the rhythm of the evening, the tension deepened further. She leaned closer under the guise of examining a magazine spread, and our shoulders brushed deliberately. Every glance she offered, every faint laugh, every soft word was charged with intimacy, a shared understanding that we were navigating something forbidden, thrilling, and entirely magnetic. There was no need for grand gestures. The weight of our connection lay in these minute, deliberate choices, in the spaces between words, in the pauses and the touches that lingered just long enough to be felt. At one point, she set a magazine down, and our fingers brushed again. Not accidental, not fleeting, but teasingly close, hinting at what neither of us had yet fully admitted. The warmth of her hand, the subtle pressure, the quiet acknowledgement of the attraction simmering between us. It was all electric. My mind raced, caught between restraint and temptation, excitement and fear, yet I found I couldn't pull away. I didn't want to. By the time I left that night, my thoughts were a whirlwind. Every glance, every touch, every teasing remark had left its mark, building anticipation that was impossible to ignore. The slow burn had grown into something undeniable, a force neither of us could resist, a delicate yet potent connection that promised danger, exhilaration, and a depth I wasn't prepared to name, yet desperately wanted to explore. And in that realization, I understood one thing clearly. We were past the point of casual games. The pull between us had become irresistible, and I was already lost in it. The seventh evening arrived with a quiet intensity that neither of us could ignore. The slow burn, which had been building over countless small touches, fleeting glances, and subtle smiles, had become a palpable force between us. It was no longer merely a whisper of tension. It had grown into something steady, urgent in its restraint, a quiet magnetism that filled every corner of the room with anticipation. I entered the living room, ostensibly to help my friend with a minor task, but my focus was entirely elsewhere. She was already there, perched on the edge of the couch with an open book in her hands, though her attention wasn't on the pages. She seemed present, fully present. Her eyes found mine almost instantly, holding mine a fraction longer than usual, and in that brief, charged moment, the air between us felt electric. I felt drawn toward her, yet aware that each step forward would carry weight far beyond what either of us had navigated before. We settled across from each other on the couch, close enough for our shoulders to brush, yet careful to maintain just enough space to savor the tension. The room was quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustle of leaves outside, creating an intimate cocoon around us. Conversation began lightly, almost mundane, stories about daily life, jokes that only slightly grazed laughter, but beneath each word was a rhythm of awareness, a dance of understanding that we were both actively participating in. Our hands met again, tentatively at first, fingers brushing as I handed her a mug of tea. The contact lingered slightly longer this time, a delicate, grounding warmth that spoke of recognition, connection, and desire without forcing it into words. She didn't flinch. She allowed the moment to stretch, giving both of us space to acknowledge the pull growing between us. "I'm glad you stayed," she said softly, her voice low, melodic, layered with meaning. Her eyes searched mine, patient yet challenging, inviting honesty without demanding it. I felt the tight coil of anticipation in my chest loosen slightly, replaced by a warm, steady awareness that what had been simmering for weeks was finally allowed to exist openly, even if unspoken. We leaned slightly closer, sharing small smiles that conveyed more than conversation ever could. Our glances lingered, subtle touches, the brush of fingers, the lean of a shoulder, building a rhythm of connection that required no words to understand. Every motion, every breath, every shared laugh had layered depth and intimacy into the space we now occupied together. It was tender, careful, electric, and profoundly human. The slow burn had reached a quiet climax. The tension was no longer awkward. It was natural, an acknowledgement of mutual attraction, curiosity, and a willingness to explore it patiently. We had crossed boundaries without violating them, navigated hesitation, and allowed desire and respect to coexist seamlessly. As I left that night, her hand lingered in mine for a moment longer than necessary, a silent promise suspended in the warm lamplight. Our eyes met one last time, holding unspoken words, shared understanding, and the anticipation of what was to come. I walked out into the night air with a heart both exhilarated and calm, knowing that this slow burn was no longer just a spark. It had become a steady, radiant flame, patient, deliberate, and utterly intoxicating. And I knew, with certainty that left no room for doubt, that this was only the beginning.